I work on ancient medicine, so medicine, and I'm interested in this particular topic, ancient medicine in the Talmud. Now, you don't have to know anything about medicine, and you don't have to know anything about the Talmud. But there are two kinds of people who might find my remarks troubling. One are doctors, because doctors like to find in ancient medicine their favorite diseases, which we don't always find. And the other one are Talmud specialists, because Talmudists, people reading the Talmud, aren't often interested in science. And science, the Talmud has a lot to say about science. And that's what interests me, and that's what I'm going to try to show you and to explain this evening. Now, I begin with a simple question. How does one describe the Babylonian Talmud? Here we have a rabbi here. We can ask him. Huh? Is it a commentary? Is it a law book? Is it a code of social practices? Is it a sort of collection of academic discourse? Is it a compendium of narratives and legends? What is it? More people probably study the Talmud today than ever before in the history of this text. But what is it? So I have a suggestion. In some sense, this Talmud is a kind of, imagine it as a kind of encyclopedia. It's an encyclopedia of all known knowledge on all known topics. I think if we have this idea, this brings us close to what we're dealing with. And one of the topics in the Talmud, which is discussed often in the Talmud, is medicine. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. But the question is this Jewish medicine? Is there anything Jewish about the medicine? Did the rabbis invent this medicine? Or does it really reflect the best medical practices of the day, say between the 2nd and the 4th century CE? Now, to understand really the framework of this question, the real ramifications, we need to understand that medicine is not an individual sort of endeavor. It's not up to individuals. Medicine reflects a system. There are carefully, easily defined systems of medicine in the ancient world. So we can identify ancient Greek medicine, ancient Egyptian medicine, ancient Babylonian medicine, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine from India. Chinese medicine, of course, then influenced Tibetan medicine and Mongolian medicine. We can define these. These are systems of medicine. Then we have Arabic medicine, of course. Often Arabic medicine was derived from these others. But what about Jewish medicine? How does it fit into this sort of scheme? Now, the important thing to know is that there are two Talmuds. There's not just the Babylonian Talmud, there's also the Jerusalem Talmud from ancient Palestine, although the Babylonian Talmud is much better known, reflecting the Jewish community of Babylonia. Now, these two Jewish communities in ancient Palestine, in Israel, and in Babylonia, what's often forgotten is that they spanned two hostile empires with a huge desert, a sort of natural iron curtain in between, dividing this Greco-Roman Empire in the west from the Persian Empire in the east. Now, it's useful to look at the map to get an idea of what we're talking about. Now, we're usually taught, and it's often thought, that there was a lot of traffic. Rabbis were always traveling back and forth to and from Palestine to Babylonia, etc. But if you look at this map, it's very graphic, and you can see these regions are far apart. And a journey by donkey was arduous, expensive, dangerous. And this was a trip that usually was made in one direction only. Hardly anybody made a round trip. So this paradigm, this usual idea that we have, that these rabbis are constantly traveling back and forth between the Jewish communities of Palestine and Babylonia, is, I consider to be a real exaggeration. Why? Because we want to avoid the idea that these communities were very different from each other, that there were sort of two Judaisms in antiquity, one in ancient Israel and the other in ancient Babylonia. But the truth is that there were major differences. And one of the differences is very important for medicine. Jewish scholars, rabbis, from Greco-Roman Palestine knew Greek. They could read Greek, they could speak Greek. For rabbis in Babylonia, in the Persian Empire, Greek was a foreign language. Now let me explain, this is a very important point. I want to emphasize this point. Babylonian rabbis knew no Greek. So Greek words in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud that we know, like afikomen and apikursis, you won't find them in the Greek dictionary. They're all corrupt, because in Babylonia they simply didn't know Greek. They didn't know anything in Babylonia about Greek philosophy or about Aristotle, or the doctors knew nothing about Hippocrates, Hippocratic medicine. Now, if this is true, and we have medicine in the Babylonian Talmud, then the obvious question is, where does it come from? Where does this medicine come from? Now, last time that anybody studied the medicine in the Babylonian Talmud was 1911. This was Julius Preuss. He was a Berlin physician, and he published this very well-known work, Biblisch-Talmudische Medizin. It's been translated into English. It's been translated into modern Hebrew. It's a classic work, and it's also full of errors. Now, the only frame of reference which Preuss had as 1911 was, of course, Greek medicine. So he tried to interpret all the medicine in the Talmud as either Greek medicine or the medicine that he knew in his own day, in 1911. Now, he had an impressive knowledge of the Talmud. He could read the Talmud, but he didn't notice this one important peculiarity of the Talmud. And many people today don't notice it as well. People who do the Daf Yomi, who study the Talmud every day, and thousands of people all over the world do this. There's some peculiarity that they don't notice, and that is that the Babylonian Talmud is a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic. Why? Because it originates from academies and schools both in ancient Palestine and Israel and in Babylonia. Now, this is very important because you can read the Talmud and not think about it. You don't think about what the language is. You're just reading the page of the Talmud and you don't notice it. Or if you're certainly reading it in the English translation, you also won't know what's Hebrew and what's Aramaic. But the point is that the Talmud consists of layers. And you have Hebrew texts. The Mishnah, one important part of the Talmud, in Hebrew, and its addendum, the Tosefta, also in Hebrew. These were from Israel, brought to the academies at some time in Babylonia. And the Tosefta, the additional information from the Tosefta, gets repeated in the Aramaic commentaries, which we call the Gemara. So this becomes an enormous omelet, a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic. But what isn't noticed, and what Preuss didn't notice, and really no one's noticed, is that when you look at the medicine in the Talmud which is in Hebrew is coming from ancient Israel. It's Greco-Roman medicine, and the medicine which is in Aramaic in the Talmud, and there's a lot of it, looks like it's coming from local Babylonia. So then the question is, what do we know about this ancient Babylonian medicine? And it turns out we know quite a lot. In the last few years in Berlin, we've had a very important research project reconstructing ancient Babylonian medicine from these sources. Cuneiform tablets in the British Museum and in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Now some of you, I don't know if any of you saw last year's exhibition on Ashurbanipal, King of the World, in the British Museum. A wonderful exhibition. This Ashurbanipal from Nineveh not only was a great king and conqueror, but he also was a great collector of tablets books, a library. He created this royal library in Nineveh. And what he included in this royal library was a large number of medical texts, a sort of ancient medical library. And what we managed to reconstruct in Berlin was a catalog. In various little bits and pieces, we reconstructed a catalog of Ashurbanipal's medical library. And it turns out there are 90 medical works listed, each one listed by its opening line, the title of the works. 90 ancient medical works. And this is 200 years before Hippocrates. And these medical works were published here, and they're very systematic and very highly organized as a medical corpus, according to parts of the body listed from head to foot, and then other kinds of general pathologies. Now, this is a remarkable discovery, and it shows us something. It shows us that ancient Babylonia contained this impressively systematic and highly organized system of medicine. It consisted of diagnosis and prognosis, pharmacology, treatments, and almost no surgery. Surgery was dangerous. So, you may ask, very good question now, That's all very well. There's all these cuneiform tablets. How does it find its way into the Babylonian Talmud? These are cuneiform tablets. It's totally different script. There's no evidence that any rabbis could read this stuff. I don't know of any rabbis being able to read these tablets. But so how are they learning this technical knowledge of medicine? How could they possibly have learned this? Now the answer to this, it's a very complex question, but the answer begins earlier. We already begin to reconstruct the answer already from a wonderful mural in the Louvre, which going back to the 8th century BCE. And these are personnel of the royal court in Syria, and the third and fourth figures here are scribes. And this scribe is writing on a clay tablet with a stylus, and this scribe, known as the sepiru or the sofer, he's writing on leather with a pen. So this one is writing in the language which we call Acadian. This one is writing in Aramaic. So already at the time we begin to see a bilingual culture already in antiquity of traditions being shared and translated, and Aramaic already serving as an official language of the empire. Now, this situation became even more, it changed even more drastically under the Persian rule after Cyrus and Darius, Achaemenid rule, when the Persians ruled the entire Near East. And Aramaic became the official language of the Persian Empire. Me Hodu ad Kush, from India all the way to Ethiopia, and everybody spoke Aramaic. Now this has results, as in any lingua franca, like today with English. That is, competing smaller languages often lose out when you have a major international language which dominates. And we can see it had results in the Near East under the Persian rule. Hebrew in ancient Israel and Akkadian in Babylonia, they remained important classical languages and they belonged to the academy, but they were no longer so widely spoken. And this because Aramaic was so dominant. So they remain as academic, scholarly languages, but not necessarily as languages of the streets. Now, what can we draw about, conclusions can we draw about rabbis in Babylonia when sitting in their academies and discussing points of law? Say, Halakhah. What language did they speak? Well, I think they spoke Aramaic, not Hebrew. Babylonian rabbis didn't sit around conversing in spoken Ivrit. They spoke the vernacular Aramaic. Now, how do we know this? We have evidence, external evidence from Babylonia, from the same period of the Talmud, and this evidence comes in the form of hundreds of these Aramaic magic bowls. like this one. These were written by Jewish experts in magic in the time of the Talmud, and they're all in Aramaic. Not a single one is in Hebrew. Now, they're in ordinary ceramic bowls. They're intended to protect or heal the family, or in some cases to invoke curses on a rival or on an enemy. And one of the great experts on these bowls is sitting right here in this room, Dan Levine, who's done an enormous amount of work in publishing these texts. Now, some of these bowls were written in Aramaic dialects, not just Jewish Aramaic. The majority is in Jewish Aramaic. Some of them are in other dialects known as Mandaic and Syriac. These are written by non-Jewish magical practitioners, and they're going to be important, and we'll see why in a minute. Now, the important thing to know about medicine in the Talmud is that it is highly technical. It has very specific terminology for names of diseases and symptoms, and also very specific terms for certain kinds of natural drugs. Now, not only are these medical recipes and prescriptions found scattered throughout the Talmud, it's a large work, but there is also a medical handbook in the Babylonian Talmud. It covers more than 2 pages of text. It's quite a lot of text in the Talmud. It's a very long passage. And it's in the tractate of Gittin, and it's a very special text. For one thing, it's anonymous. It's very unusual to have such a long text in the Babylonian Talmud that's not ascribed to anyone. Either we say, oh, this is, the rabbis taught this, or you give the name of a certain rabbi who teaches this. This text is anonymous. That's the first thing about it, which is interesting. The second thing is that it's very highly organized. It gives medical symptoms, diseases, and remedies organized from head to foot. So it's a real medical handbook, right? Now, and it appears suddenly in the middle of the Talmud, in this tractate of Gittin about divorce. And it occurs in a strange place after a long story about King Solomon and capturing the demon Ashmodai, and because of this, Solomon almost gets kicked off of his throne, almost loses his throne. So it doesn't have a real logical niche into the Talmud. It just suddenly appears. And the question is, where does this come from? Now, here's an example. This is the first opening passage of this medical handbook. It opens with a head, so blood from the head. It's the first symptom. Now, as you can see, what happens is, it starts, for those of you who can read Hebrew, all of these symptoms listed always start with a lamed, 4, and then it gives the condition which is aimed for. This is dama d'resha, for blood of the head, a kind of vague symptom. We're not sure really what this means. Now then we have a list of ingredients, medical ingredients which follows, pharmaceutical substances. Now, what's interesting about these substances? You can read them in Hebrew, shur, bina, asadara, chilpa, etc., etc. Now, and you have the translations here, willow, myrtle, olive, poplar, cloves, etc., whatever they are, all right? Doesn't matter. What's important about these substances is that all of them have an equivalent, similar term in ancient Akkadian. And these words in Akkadian, it's not just that you find them in the dictionary. These pharmaceutical terms all show up in ancient Babylonian recipes on tablets. So this is not just an odd collection of pharmaceutical substances for these particular symptoms, but it's substances which probably go back to earlier Babylonian medicine that we find on the tablets. That's the supposition. And the question is, can we prove this? And the answer is yes, we can. So here's an example of recipes here. It's got a little bit out of It's got a little bit out of sort here, but you can see it's recipe 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And what's happened is that named here, named like Shublilta, has an Akkadian equivalent Shambaliltu. Huh? But many of these terms, like Tachle Kres, has an Akkadian equivalent Sachlu. Words for honey, Akkadian, and these words in these from tablets, medical tablets, all occur in medical contexts. I haven't just looked them up in the dictionary and just happened to find them. They all occur in similar kinds of contexts. So when you find over and over again this pattern, it means that we're on the right track. That the materia medica in the Babylonian Talmud in Aramaic goes back to earlier local Babylonian medicine. Now, but still the question is, how does it work? How do we get from these names in tablets coming into the Talmud in Aramaic? We still need to know the mechanism for how this exchange took place and what the sources are. Now, the answer to this question takes us to some surprising places. Now, one of the exotic communities of Iraq and Iran, even today, they survive today, are the Mandaeans. Now, Mandaeans are an ancient religious community. In a way, we could call them pagans because they're not Christians and they're not Jews. And they believe in many gods. Apart from believing in many gods, they also believe in John the Baptist. And one of their major ceremonies and rites is baptism. And so it's a very strange kind of mixture, these Mandaeans, but they're still there. You can still find Mandaean communities in Iran and in Iraq. And until recently, they all spoke Aramaic. Now, this dialect of Aramaic is called Mandaic. And it's very, very close to the Jewish Aramaic of the Babylonian Talmud. Very, very close. The only difference is they have a different script, their own Mandaic script. So they don't use the square letters which we say. The Hebrew letters, they have their own, but it's still an alphabet. It's just much more cursive. And they also wrote these magic bowls in their script, with very similar language. At the same time as Jewish experts are writing magic bowls, we have these Mandaic experts writing these magic bowls. Now, one of the great experts on these Mandaeans was the wife of the British consul in Baghdad in the mid-20th century. She was known as Lady Drower, the inimitable Lady Drower. Now, she managed to learn Mandaean, and she also managed to become so well acquainted with the Mandaeans, she sort of penetrated many of their mysteries of this highly secretive religious community. It was amazing what she was able to accomplish. And Lady Drower's publications and manuscript collections, she left her manuscripts to the Bodleian Library. These are still enormously important. Now, one of her publications is this. Here's the Mandaean script. You can see it looks nothing like Hebrew. This is her publication in 1946. She wrote everything out in Latin letters, and then she translated it into English. And this important text is called the Phylactery for Rue. Rue, whatever rue is, this type of plant, huh? Now, what's interesting about this text is that this text talks about a demon called Rucha, Hebrew Ruach, which sits on all of the organs of the human body, starting with the head, going down to the foot. And as the Rucha demon sits on an organ in the human body, it causes a disease. And the amazing thing is that the list of organs and the list of diseases matches the diseases in the Gittin medical handbook in the Talmud. You see, so blood of the head, this Tzilchata headache, there you have it in Mandaean. Here we have cataract, has an Acadian word, Barukte, I can use this thing, I suppose. if I know how to do it. Yes. Cataract here, burukte, buruku. This is the Mandaean word. You can see it's the same. This is an Acadian word, chinku, meaning the palate, tonsillitis. Here he is in the Mandaean. You can see. Here's a rare word, shigruna. There it is in Mandaean. So this is the Talmud. This is Acadian. This is Mandaic. So we're all fishing in the same waters here. So it means that the rabbis, when they're organizing quoting this medical handbook in the Talmud, they're not taking it directly from these tablets, but they're taking it from local Aramaic medical texts circulating in Iraq in their day. This is the local medical literature of Babylonia that the rabbis are quoting. They're citing it. They're not inventing it. And that's the important point here. Now, but this isn't the only place where we find local Babylonian medicine. We find it in another very surprising source, in the British Museum. It's this book. This book was published in 1913, 2 years after Julius Preuss wrote his Talmudic medicine book. This book was produced by the famous curator in the British Museum, E.A. Wallace Budge. And he tells a story, an interesting story, about how he came across this book. And it's in another dialect of Aramaic called Syriac, usually associated with Christian texts, but not always. Now, and they're Syriac magic bowls. So that's the third group of magic bowls that we have. So this is a medical book. It's very long. It's 600 pages, 600 folios. Huh? And Budge, of course, found this in Iraq, not in Syria. Normally Syriac we associate with Syria. This is Syriac language from Iraq. He found it in a monastery in Mosul. We have no idea if the monastery still survives. And Budge did what every good curator of the British Museum does. He saw this thing and he said, we need this for the British Museum. Now, of course, he was very disappointed because they didn't agree to give it to him, but they made a compromise. They hired a local scribe, and the local scribe made a copy, hand copy. And this is hand copy, is what we now have in the British Museum, and this is Budge's publication. But what's interesting about this book is this. It has 3 sections, this long book. The first section of this book, every Budge loved this because this is translations of Galen into Aramaic. So this is the first time we see real Greek medicine coming into Mesopotamia, coming to the east. So there are many, many parts of Galen that have been translated and brought into Mesopotamia, and this for Budge was a really wonderful discovery. The second part of this book is about astrology. It's a kind of strange mixture. No one's quite sure how to evaluate it. The third part of this book is recipes, medical recipes organized from head to foot. About 265 recipes, I think I've counted, and they've never been studied since 1913. No one has written a single word about these recipes since Budge published them over 100 years ago. But Budge said something about them. He said this third section contains 400 prescriptions, many of them of most extraordinary character. These must have been written by physicians who were ignorant and superstitious. Why? Because they're the Orient. They're not Greek. They have no Greek words. They don't look like Galen. So for Budge, this was just Oriental nonsense. Now, what's amazing about it is the similarities of these recipes in the Syriac Book of Medicine, both with earlier Akkadian recipes on tablets and also with the Talmud. Now here is an example. In the top here, what you have is a translation of a text taken from around, this belongs to about 700 BCE. It's on a tablet, and it says what you should do is if you want to if you want to cure eye disease, what you do is you go find some small bird chicks and you prick out their eyes with a needle, and then you wait for the mother bird to come, and when she sees that her chicks are blind, she'll go and find a plant which she can then bring back to the nest to cure their diseases. Now, it all sounds very horrible to us, but I mean, medical science does many worse things with animals today. Huh? But what's interesting about that is from the Syriac Book of Medicine, we say this. It has this. You take the chick of a swallow, pull out its eyes, leave it for 3 days. The mother comes and sees that it's blind. She goes and brings a certain root. That's the root you need in order to cure eye disease. I think there's no question here. This is the same kind of text. Now, there's another text. This one is about spleen disease. Now we have it in the Talmud, in our medical handbook, and we have it in one of these recipes in the 3rd section of the Syriac Book of Medicine. Now the problem with the spleen was, and all ancient systems of medicine thought about this, where's the spleen, what's the spleen, none of us even know. We're not doctors what the spleen is, but the idea in the ancient world is you have a pain in the spleen, and it must be because the spleen is too moist, and you have to dry it out. This was agreed by all ancient systems of medicine. So the Talmud says you take the spleen of a virgin kid, and it's interesting because it uses the Aramaic, uses an exact Acadian expression. It means a kid which is not yet opened. So this is a kid which has not yet had relations with the other animals. You smear it on the oven and let the man stand near it and says, just as this spleen dried up, may the spleen of so-and-so dry up. Sounds more magical to us than medical, but that's what happens. But the Syriac Book of Medicine, you say the same thing. You take a stream which is dried up and you suspend it for 3 days on his left side, and you hang it over the oven, and it dries out, and the spleen will dry out. So the idea is pretty similar here, between the Syriac Book of Medicine and the Talmud, that the systems are very similar. Now, what do we have to say about this? What is the evidence which we're seeing here? First of all, Acadian medicine on these ancient cuneiform tablets was not yet forgotten by the first few centuries of our era. The Talmud is witness to the fact that they still know this medicine. The same terminology and instructions we found in these Acadian tablets, they're appearing in these Aramaic dialects. And the second thing is that the rabbis weren't making this stuff up. They weren't inventing medicine. They're quoting and adapting the local medicine of their era and of their environment in Babylonia. Now, this brings us to a couple of more personal questions. So which rabbis in the Talmud were interested in medicine and why? What gave them the authority to discuss medicine? Now you have to remember, we don't know about any rabbis in the Talmud being physicians. Nobody claims to be a physician. But on the other hand, you have to also bear in mind that nobody in the ancient world has a diploma. Nobody sits with a picture on his wall saying he's MD or FRS. These don't exist in the ancient world. So how do you know who's a real doctor and who's a quack? Well, it's not always easy to know. Now, what about these rabbis in the Talmud? How did they have the authority to discuss medicine and comment on medicine? Where did they study? Where did they learn? Now, this is not a very easy question to answer, but we have a couple of cases in the Talmud that gives us some clues. Now, there's a Babylonian scholar, a rabbi in the Talmud, who seems to have a lot of knowledge of medicine, and his name is Abbaye. Now, he lived at the end of the 3rd century and the beginning of the 4th century CE. Now, Abbaye is only known for his halachic discussions. He's a great halachic scholar, and he's always arguing with his colleague Rava, and we know him from many, many other discussions. But there are 24 cases in the Talmud of Abbaye giving information about medical recipes. Far more than any other rabbi in the Talmud, Abbaye is the one who seems to know the most. Now, it's very unusual, his medical knowledge. for one really, really rather eccentric reason. In every one of these recipes attributed to Abbaye, he always claims to know about medicine, to know this knowledge from his mother. So the recipes always begin with the same statement, Amra li aim, as my mother told me. Now, this would all be perfectly acceptable, except for one problem. The Talmud claims that Abbaye's mother died in childbirth. Now, if we look at a few of these examples of Abbaye, they're rather interesting. Here's one. It's a rather interesting one. Right? Now, the problem here is about gynecology. What does menstrual pain feel like? Now, men are writing all of these gynecological textbooks, but it's obvious that they need women informants. This is true of all gynecological writings of the ancient world. Even the great Soranus, the Greek Soranus of Ephesus, obviously had women informants, but they never give their names. They never say this, actually. But here we have an interesting passage because we have the names of women informants. This is what this passage is trying to do. These three notable rabbis, Rava, Rav Papa, and Abbaye, they all giving information gathered from women about the severity of menstrual cramps. Now, one rabbi cites his wife, you see? He said, my wife, who happens to be Rav Chizda's daughter, she told me it's like the stab of a scalpel. That's what it feels like to have menstrual cramps. Another rabbi, Rav Papa, said, my wife, who's Abba Sura's daughter, so he's identifying her, told me, I always like the feeling of hard bread on the gums. Chewing hard bread, if you don't have teeth, you just have gums. That's what it feels like. Now, Abbaye says, at the top, my mother told me that the pain is like hot water on the head of a bald person. Now, how would a woman know this? So, already we can see a problem here. Now, we have to understand that the Talmud often does this. The Talmud invents dialogues. The Talmud can take people who live at different places and different times and put them together as if they're speaking in the same room and they're having a conversation, when really they're not. What the editor of the Talmud has done many years later, centuries later, is edit this text together because this all seemed to have the same thematic similarity. That is, he wants to see this as women informants. Now the difference is that these two, Rava and Rav Papa, name their women informants. My wife is so-and-so's daughter, so we know exactly who she is. Abbaye doesn't do this. He just says, my mother told me. So this is a problem. Is he really being told by his dead mother that this is what's happening? So we have to look for other cases of Abbaye. Now here's one that has to do with paediatrics, where Abbaye says, now there's a context here. It's all about raising infants, and should young children wear shoes on Yom Kippur, this kind of question. Huh? Should they wear leather shoes on Yom Kippur? So this is a question that's raised. And then Abbaye makes this statement. He says, my mother told me, for raising infants, rub him with hot water and oil. Not bad advice. Small infant. Then when the baby gets a bit older, then you have the child feed him egg in kutach. Now, kutach is a typical Babylonian gruel. It's every single person who came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylonia commented about kutach, how terrible this was. How can these people eat this kind of food? It's a bit like Americans coming here and trying Marmite. They couldn't stand it. People from Palestine couldn't stand this stuff. But here it says, it's a good idea if you want a child that gets an infant, then you feed it egg and kutach. And then if it goes a little bit more, what do? You break the medical instruments. Now, what does this mean? Now, no commentator has really worked out what this means, but I have an idea. And the idea is this. We often find reference in these medical texts where the statement is made, the patient ought to get well before the surgeon shows up with his scalpel, with his medical instruments. Because if a surgeon comes, then he's in real trouble. Huh? Surgery, of course, was dangerous. And I think that this may be what we have here, a reference to this kind of idea, that even with children, better not to have the surgeon come to look at them if you want the child to survive. Now, and here is, of course, information from Abbaye's mother. Now we have, and you can see this is what they're worried about, of course. Now, here we have, I'll just give you a couple more. I have a lot of these examples, but I'm going to end with just a couple more. So here we have Abbaye also, where his mother talks to him. And this is a kind of discussion which we know from something called the Babylonian Diagnostic Handbook. The Diagnostic Handbook is one of these collections of Babylonian cuneiform tablets again, with 15,000 entries of symptoms from head to foot. So if someone suffers from this and such a symptom, this is likely to be the result. It's a kind of prognosis. What's going to happen if you have bloodshot eyes and you have headache and fever, etc.? The main question, of course, always is the patient going to live or will the patient die? And this is very important for the physician's reputation. Prognosis. Now, this proves whether he's a good physician or not, if he knows whether the patient will live or die, will survive or not. Now, what we have here is an interesting case where we have prognosis and remedy, which we also find in Babylonia. First you give the prognosis, and then you say, it looks bad, but try this. Here's a remedy. And we have this here. And also, in this Babylonian Diagnostic Handbook, we have a section which is concerned with the age of the patient. If the patient is such and such year old, this is likely to be the result. Now here we have the same thing. Here we have a 6-year-old stung by a scorpion. Probably is not going to live, but is there a remedy? Well, you can try. Bile of a bird of prey in beer. Let him drink it. Rub it and let him drink it. Very typical kind of Babylonian recipe. A 1-year-old child stung by a bee, right? Probably won't live. And why bee sting? Maybe was not understood as the child may be allergic, etc. What's the remedy? You take creepers of a date palm. Again, another Akkadian word. In water, let him drink it. So this is more information coming from Abbaye's mother, but it all looks very Babylonian. So we have one more case. This is the last case I want to show you. This is a pun. Now, it's very hard to describe a pun. Why? Because a pun is a kind of joke, and in order to understand this joke, you have to know the languages involved. This is an Acadian pun in the Talmud, which shows if you don't know Akkadian, you're not going to get the joke. And this is also told by Abbaye, by his mother. And what does it say? It says, eating dates, the word is tamre, before bread, meaning a meal, is like taking an axe to a date palm. No commentator has ever explained what this means. You can look in Rashi, you can look in modern commentators, no one quite knows what this means. Huh? And if you take the tamre, the dates, and you eat them after a meal, this is like a door bolt. Now, why is this a pun? It's because there are these Akkadian words which are homonyms. Now, the first homonym is the word aru. It means a date palm leaf. The second word, aru, means to cut palm branches. You do this with an axe, of course, but it's a homonym of that is a word to vomit. So when Abbaye says, if you have dates, you have a lot of dates before on an empty stomach, taking an axe to a date palm is going to mean you're going to have indigestion. It's going to cause you to vomit. Now, what happens afterwards? Afterwards is like a door bolt. Well, what is this? They're in Akkadian medical recipes, the anus or the rectum is called the gate of the rectum. The anus is the gate of the rectum. This was a term so that if this is bolted and locked, you're going to be constipated. So for Abbaye, this is a This is a humorous way of remembering this proverb. And of course, you can only get the point if you know the Acadian terminology that's behind it. I can't think of any other explanation for this term. So this brings us back to the question, who is Abbaye's mother? And this is the crucial question because this is the question of authority. And I think I have an answer. And the answer is rather simple. Instead of reading Amra li aim, my mother told me, I think the original reading was Amre li uman. The professor told me this. Now, how do I explain that? What's the problem here? How does mother get to be professor? The problem is that the Talmud is a text which is edited probably in the 7th century CE. And Abbaye is living around 320. No, I think a bit later, 370 CE. Huh? So there's 300 or 400 years in between the editing of the Talmud and when Abbaye lives. Now, Abbaye, we can tell from this pun, is obviously still knowledgeable about local dialects, language in Babylonia. By the time the Talmud is edited, this information is lost, long, long gone. So they don't understand when Abbaye says, Amre li uman. The professor told me this. Why? Because an uman in Akkadian, the umanu was the highest academic title in the ancient Babylonian school. He was the professor. We have other terms for other academic positions in the school, but the umanu was the professor. And we often have technical tablets, cuneiform tablets, with a colophon at the bottom, and it says this information is mipi umani, from the mouth of the professor. This was orally dictated by the professor, by the expert. So when Abbaye quite naturally says, an expert told me this. This is why I know this information. By the time the Talmud is edited several hundred years later, they simply don't understand this because uman in Aramaic doesn't mean professor. It means a hand worker. It's the plumber. So for them it made no sense. So what the editors of the Talmud did is they simply edited the text. They had a minor change. They took out the nun, and you end up with my mother told me. But I think it's really clear here that Abbaye is giving a statement of authority. How does he know about medicine, the medicine that he's discussing in the Talmud? This is expert information which was told to him from local Babylonians who knew about local Babylonian medicine, and this is where he gets it. So it turns out that the medicine in the Talmud is not Jewish, it's not invented, but it's real medicine and reflects the medicine of its day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now that was fantastic. Let's say that's presumably Hebrew and that's Aramaic. One of the other things. Okay, I want to open up this to people's question.
Right. All these recipes sound very medieval to me, and I'm wondering if they came down through the centuries because women who practiced this were later called witches. You take a toad, you take this, you take that, you mix it all together. So did it have longevity, these recipes?
I think they did. I think the problem is that everything changed with modern medicine. We lost our access to natural medicine, natural substances. And I think, now of course, natural substances, we say, well, did they work? Well, they didn't have clinical trials. They didn't have laboratories, but they had a filter of about 7,000 years from Neolithic period. Trial and error over a very long period for these natural substances to see what they were. And I believe they were repeated over and over again because they were found to work. Some of these things work. I still take turmeric for my back pain. Huh? Well, turmeric, yes, right. These things work. Huh? So it's not surprising that medieval recipes will look quite similar. But you mentioned toad, and that's interesting. And this is one of the interesting arguments about medieval medicine. And that is that one aspect of natural medicine that we see in these ancient texts is what we call drek apotheke. Disgusting substances like toad urine or right, dog excrement that you put into these recipes. Now, what's interesting about that, in the ancient world we have secret double lists that says dog excrement is daffodil, toad urine is willow bark. So what we have is, and so these ancient doctors knew, but this was secret information. Why? Because they don't want other people making their recipes. They don't want laymen to try to make these recipes. If you want to make recipes, you have to be a professional. So they put these secret terms in, drek apotheke, into the recipes intentionally in order to put off laymen from trying to reproduce them. Now the question is, did this information survive into the Middle Ages? We don't know, because the drek apotheke in medieval recipes look like people are taking this seriously. But in the Talmud, it's very interesting. In our medical handbook in Gittin, when they refer to drek apotheke, they usually say, "Tis zaher, be careful. This can cause harm." So they may not have known what the substance was, but they knew there was something wrong with using this kind of disgusting ingredients in their recipes. So this whole question of pharmacology is enormously interested and totally unstudied, even today.
Thank you. That's so interesting, because the first rule to a doctor from Greek times is do no harm.
Do no harm, right. Which is, everybody signed up to that.
Thank you.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. Could I just check on one thing? The Talmud was written in about 600.
It was edited. That's different. 600 or 700. We're not even sure. Right.
It was sort of put together.
Right.
Sort of thing.
Right.
And Galen,
No, he's much earlier. He's 200. He's 2nd century.
is about 200 or 300.
Right.
But Galen's theory of disease and puberty, talking about venesection, bloodletting, or making burr holes in the skull to let out the cooking. Isn't it surprising that some of this Greek theory never translated itself into the Talmud? And if
This is why the Syriac Book of Medicine is, that's why it's so important, because this is Galen finally coming to the East, probably not before the Byzantium period. This first part of this Book of Medicine is probably not earlier than Byzantium, so after the Talmud is already edited. Particularly the medicine of the Talmud. The medicine of the Talmud probably dates from 3rd and 4th century, not later. So nobody's reading Galen in Babylonia. It's not like today where you put something on the internet and everybody reads it the next day. Huh? It's, in the ancient world, it took hundreds of years for these texts to be translated and to be spread. Even with the Greek-speaking world, everybody wasn't reading Galen. Huh? This is, we can't measure these things by our modern standards. It takes a long time for knowledge to spread and to become known. So I'm not surprised at all that they knew nothing about Galen in Babylonia in the Talmud.
It's interesting, as a dental surgeon, my eye pricked up when I saw cloves. So that's still used now for toothpaste,
Yes.
and that was 17 centuries ago. So it's quite humbling that we're still using the same palliative for acute toothache.
The ancient physicians sometimes got things right, but usually for the wrong reasons. But we can't blame them because they had no instruments. They had no microscopes. They didn't have thermometers. Huh? They just had to were dependent upon just observation and looking and seeing what works. Huh? Trial and error. But they did often come up. Often enough, they came up with reasonably effective measures. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been repeated over and over and over again over the centuries.
In the Middle Ages, the Ramban, who's Maimonides, who was then actually a physician, when he wrote the Mishnah Torah, which is kind of a Reader's Digest of the Talmud, then he threw out a lot of things.
Yes.
Superstition, but also medical things, which he thought is nonsense. Have you worked on that?
No, the point about this is Maimonides' position was quite correct. We can't be following medical practices from hundreds of years ago, because Maimonides was, of course, familiar now, this time with Galen and with Hippocrates and Aristotle. He was on a completely different level. And of course, this is a completely different technical level. So for him, you don't go back to an early, we wouldn't also do the same thing. We wouldn't go back to an earlier level of technical knowledge when we already have advanced knowledge. Huh? So his position was quite clear. But superstition is the wrong word to use in this case. Huh? So there's a lot of magic in the Talmud as well as medicine. But everybody ascribed to this magic because magic was a way of helping people psychologically, huh? To somehow deal with problems and deal with everyday issues, health problems as well. So magic was a kind of tool. It was also a healing sort of tool. Huh? So superstition is what the word that they use when they refer to somebody else's magic, huh? Foreign magic.
That's how he called it.
Yeah, I know, but it's really not. Yeah, but at his time, of course, he was too sophisticated. He couldn't accept these Talmudic recipes anymore, and we can understand why. It's perfectly understandable.
I'd like to ask a little question.
Yeah.
We see these different languages and different peoples and different cultures, and often living in the same place. And you're working from texts, but my feeling is, and I wonder what you're thinking, how this might work, is that orality has a big part.
Of course it does. Of course it does.
So people can't necessarily always read the texts in the other languages. So how does this knowledge move around? The sort of Amralian, I like your explanation, but we like the sort of, Bobemaisis, old mother's tales, and that's how it was understood for many years. But there is something about this element of orality. So do these big ideas move more through orality?
I think once you have Aramaic as a common language, then it's easy to have oral transmission of text. And they were used to technical information being remembered. Remember, we think of the oral Torah, huh? So for hundreds of years, if that's not written down, you have people remember it. And remember what Herodotus said, when a man learned to read and write, he lost his memory. So the idea of having oral conversations and acquiring technical knowledge is perfectly consistent with what we find in the ancient world. And Aramaic is the ideal kind of intercommunal communication instrument between different confessions. So you can be Jewish, you can be pagan, you can be Christian, it doesn't matter. You have this Aramaic language for communication, and you can talk. And you can get information from an expert in this way. And there are references in the Talmud to special places where rabbis used to go to meet pagan priests to get technical information, say, about astronomy. Babylonians were great astronomers. Huh? So we know that these places existed. And some people thought this is dangerous. I don't want to meet these people. But other rabbis were perfectly willing to do this. And this is oral transmission of information.
Does it not show that the rabbis at the time who were writing these recipes in Aramaic and having accepted them, does it not show that they were integrated into the society in which they lived?
I think it does, yes.
And were able to accept what had gone before as the truth. And the reason why in the Babylonian Talmud that there is not prolonged discussion about medicine is that they had nothing more to say. They accepted what it was and what was being practiced, and therefore they moved on. And that is why it's restricted in Gita. And then when there was the Greek influence from Galen, when Galen had considerable influence for hundreds of years in European medicine. And that's why they didn't.
I have an answer to your question. I would phrase things somewhat differently.
Please do.
Science is shared knowledge, and everybody can sign up to it. And I don't think that the rabbi said, here's a little bit of medicine, now we've shot our bolt. I think that really what we have in the Talmud is only a fragment of what existed among Jewish physicians and practitioners and what they knew about medicine. It happens that we have this unusual fragment in the Talmud, and we're lucky to have it, but I think there was much more that we simply don't have. The Talmud is not a complete record of all of the writings of the Babylonian Jewish community. It's only just a sample. Now, what's interesting is we see that there's much more from the Talmud because of these magic bowls.
Yes.
Hundreds of these magic bowls. We see that there is already, that we didn't know about these before the late 19th century when they first turned up in archaeological excavations. So we know that there was a large magical literature, and they were probably grimoire. There were probably magical handbooks circulating, but because they're written on leather, they don't survive. These survive because they're written on clay. Now, the interesting question is, which I always ask is, these bowls only existed for a couple of hundred years. They show up in about 500 ACE, and then by the time Islam comes to Iraq, they tend to disappear. This is so, most people think, well, it's because of Islam coming to Iraq, that's why they disappear. But why should that be? Why should that change anything? So I don't think that's the correct answer, but it's still a question. These are ceramic bowls. They're on materials which you will find. And why do they only exist for 200 years? Why shouldn't they have been earlier, and why shouldn't they be later? It's a very unusual thing to have a group of texts which exist for such a relatively short period. And my answer to this is that these texts begin to appear in the generation after Abbaye, when the Akkadian material is really lost. Nobody in Babylonia can read these tablets anymore. Then it's really dead. The last priest has died, and nobody can read this stuff. And that's like the hard disk of your computer packs up, and you can't access your data anymore. So all of this technical medicine is lost. But people are still getting sick. So you have to invent other kinds of strategies for them to try to get well. Huh? And we suddenly have these magic bowls. And why do they disappear? Because we have Galen. Because we have technical medicine coming into this region again. And medicine trumps magic. If you have technical medicine, you don't need magic. And that's why I think this literature existed for such a relatively short time. But it shows something about the fact that we have this literature outside of the Talmud that existed, and people are interested, and they're using it. Because medicine and magic, these are sciences. And science is shared by everyone. All right, is that enough?
A few more questions, just the last one. Okay, thank you very much, Mark.
A glass of wine or fruit, and I want to announce the next class event. So we have the Holocaust Memorial Day next Monday at 6 o'clock at Solent University, organized in collaboration with the Solent University. We will have also a speaker, Mark Rigman, who will talk about the genocidal resonance in today's climate refuge crisis. And the next lecture here will be on the 4th of February. It will be the Carlton lecture delivered by Shirley Gilbert on South African Jews, the Holocaust, and apartheid. And yeah, thank you so much for this magical lecture, and please